I'm Gerda Stevenson. I'm a writer and a director and an actor and a singer-songwriter. And I grew up in the Scottish borders in a wee village called West Linton. My parents from Lancashire, in the cotton mills of Lancashire, Blackburn and Nelson. And I went to the local primary school and the local high school, People's High School. At the age of 7, that was a very kind of big moment in our family's life, because we moved to South Africa for just under 2 years. My dad, the composer, pianist Ronald Stevenson, at that stage he was working as a school teacher in Edinburgh schools, and he was composing at night, and he became very unwell. He had a collapse of the lung, and a friend of his, a fellow musician who was the head of the College of Music of Cape Town, invited him to come out and have a job there where he would have time to compose, and it was absolutely extraordinary going from the small village of West Linton, where we hardly ever saw a black face. There was one man I remember came to the village to see my dad, who was from Ghana, and he was a musician, and he appeared in this beautiful African kind of gown and a sort of skull cap, and he just looked amazing. It was kind of bright orange. He got off the bus, and I remember that just being amazing. So I was very excited about going to South Africa, but subsequently I've asked my parents, why did we go there at the height of apartheid? Weren't you politically aware? Because they're very politically aware people, my parents. And my dad died in 2015. My mum says, well, we were naive. And it was just, for a 7-year-old, it was a staggering experience to see apartheid at its height. And it was absolutely horrific. And you couldn't avoid seeing it because you had, non-blacks, non-whites, whites only, blacks only signs everywhere. And it just didn't make any sense. And we were the only people in the vicinity that we knew of who didn't have a car, the only white people who didn't have a car, who didn't have a servant. And because all the whites had servants. And I've written about this in a book of short stories that is, a lot of it is autobiographical, and I think that experience in South Africa is the most vivid of my whole, I think I could say of my whole life. It was so different. Everything was so intense. And I remember when we arrived in the staff house, there was a kind of concrete hut out the back, and I was exploring, running around. I was a very enthusiastic child, and I thought, wow, it's like a kennel or something for an animal, this place. And we were told this was the servants' quarters, and it was all concrete with a kind of concrete bed, and it was just unbelievable. And there were young women from the townships who used to knock on the door every week, toothless, and they were young, asking for work. And my mother had, very working class belief. She was brought up to believe you clean up your own mess. You deal with your own dirt. You don't have servants. Kind of approach. And so we didn't have a servant, and it was, of course, it was beautiful. It is geographically, it is the most stunning place. We looked out of our kitchen window and saw Devil's Peak and Table Mountain was further along, and it was just such a beautiful place. Everything was vibrant. The butterflies seemed huge. The protea flowers were huge. There were these Livingston daisies all the way along the roads, which were just rainbow coloured, kind of those glittering leaves that they've got. It was just, everything was so vivid and fabulous. But my brother hated it. He just longed for Scotland and was utterly homesick. And there was a black gardener in the school that I went to, Rustenburg Girls' School, and I remember striking up a friendship with this elderly man. He was very nice, and I got silkworms from a girl in the school, and he used to give me mulberry leaves for these silkworms to feed on because I needed a supply. And but eventually I was told by the head that I wasn't to speak to him, to the boy. He was called a boy, although he was in his, I don't know, I remember thinking he was probably, old enough to be my granddad. So yeah, eventually we left. It was very clear that, my dad had some black students who would come to the house, and one of them, the police, who looked like kind of, they were like Nazis, the way they were dressed, these boots and guns, as I remember. I mean, I don't know if that's accurate, but that's how I remember it. They were very scary. They weren't like the police, the bobbies in Westland and in Scotland. The whole place felt very on edge, exciting but on edge. And one of the students, he was in some trouble and didn't seem to appear again. And I think there was an anxiety about just, that I don't think my dad could have got into trouble because he was a British citizen, but the whole place just was not a place to bring up children. And my dad steeped himself in he went out to the townships and learnt about the African music, drumming in particular. And he composed what has become his most famous work, the Passacaglia, while he was out there. And there's a big African drumming section to it, which is absolutely thrilling, where he uses the strings of the piano. So yeah, that was an absolutely amazing time and had a huge impact on me as a 7 to 9 year old. And I'm glad of it because I think it, the horrendous injustice of that system. There was an absolutely horrific experience I had, that we all had as a family. We went on a bus in Cape Town, where we lived, or in the provinces of Cape Town. Apparently it was more liberal than in other areas like Johannesburg and Durban, apparently. So whites and blacks would travel on the bus together, but the blacks were at the back on this bus on this day, and we were in the front with whites. And we were going to a Highland gathering, kind of expats thing, because my brother was so homesick. So he had his kilt on, and it was all tossing the caber and all that kind of stuff, bagpipes. So strange. And on the way back, there was a black man who got on the bus, and I can remember every moment of it. He was wearing kind of dungarees, work clothes, and he was trying to find his ticket, his return ticket, and he couldn't. And he was accused by the conductor, who was an Afrikaner, and I knew it was Afrikaans because I was learning Afrikaans at school. At school, we used to march round. We all little white girls, like something out of Enid Blyton. We would march round the tables with Miss Dobby, singing in Afrikaans. Ek is soldaat op en rek op revier en handskit krap me kop met roembom hier en roembom daar. Hoera, Zuid-Afrika. I don't know if that's me making up Afrikaans, but I remember it. That's what we sang as little girls, walking around our school desks with pretend guns. It was a police state. It was horrendous. So I recognised the conductor as being Afrikaans because I could hear it. And he was accusing this man the black man of not having a ticket. And of course, in South Africa, you have people were graded under the apartheid system. You could be Cape coloured, which would be sort of black, but white element within it, and there was black and there was white. And the black man he was very upset, and you could see he was afraid, but he then accused the conductor of he said, "You're a coloured man," which was an astonishing thing to say. And it was an accusation, meaning you're a Cape coloured, you're not a white. So he was grabbed, and the conductor went up to the driver and said something. And the bus stopped outside a police station, and the conductor asked the bus, "Who'll hold this kafir for me?" I mean, I remember, it's astonishing that I remember every moment of this, because it was like witnessing, it's so scary. And the conductor went into the police station while the guy was held by another Afrikaner who got up and said he'd told him. And then they came out, this kind of looking like Mounties, these policemen. And one of them grabbed him and kicked the black man across the road, kicked him through the gate of the police station and up the path, kept kicking him till he was kicked through the door. And my mum said, "He'll be lucky if he comes out with his teeth in." And my dad, had tried to get up to say something, but Mum had pulled him down because, they were scary, these police. And there was an old white lady sitting next to us or behind us who'd said, "Let's just carry on, let's stop this, But and so I've written a story about it, about that experience in my book, Letting Go, among other stories of my childhood. So I think that's the most vivid element in my childhood. At the age of 7, I had a wonderful time growing up in the Scottish borders. It was, rural. We used to run around. There were no cars on the street at all. It's now thick with cars all the way up and down the street, and you actually get traffic jams in the village of Westlinton. And we used to go up into the hills, me and my friend Jenny, who I'd known since I was born, still a great, great friend. And we had all kinds of escapades. We used to, I loved the book Huckleberry Finn, which my dad read to me. He read to me and my sister, and I can't remember him reading it to my brother. My brother's 3 years older than me. But anyway, I remember Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, and those books just completely inspired me. I just loved them. And the whole idea of of Huck and Jim camping out on is it Jackson Island, and the thrill of the whole outdoors and everything. So Jenny and I used to go camping as kids and light fires and cook sausages and we were also very creative. My mum and dad were wonderfully facilitating. They used to make puppets for us. My mum worked at a Rudolf Steiner residential home for adults. Well, not adults actually, it is now, but in those days it's called Garvold Westlinton. It was for tiny little children right up to well into adulthood. And she got a job there when not long after she was married, while my dad was teaching in Edinburgh. And so the Steiner system is, although we're not adherents of the Steiner system and its accompanying religion, anthroposophy, we, the family, nevertheless, I think was very influenced by the way in which Rudolf Steiner, as a philosopher and teacher, brought the arts into the very centre of education, of his education system. So my parents always facilitated us in all kinds of things, making puppets, and they made puppets for us. I remember one Christmas, Mum and Dad made us a whole set of puppets, and Mum got the local joiner to make us a puppet theatre, and she sewed all the curtains and drawstrings, and it was so exciting. So my friend Jenny and I used to do puppet shows and write the plays. My dad once wrote us a puppet play and brought puppets back from Germany, I remember, when he was doing a concert tour, and he wrote us a puppet play to go with the puppets. So there was, it was, and so I always felt hugely able to express myself, and I had a very happy childhood. The house was full of music, full of visitors all the time. Hugh McDermott lived down the road. He used to come to visit. John Ogden, the great pianist, would come to visit, and all kinds of artists. And so it felt like a very stimulating place to be. And there was lots and lots of conversation at the table, long meal times with lots of conversation. Sometimes my granny would come up from Lancashire, my dad's mum, that is, and she was quite shy. She worked in the cotton mills from the age of 12, and Grandad was a fireman on the railways. My mum was estranged from her parents. They were cotton mills as well, and because Dad was a conscientious objector as a young man, not during the war, but after it, when conscription was still in. Dad, because he wasn't old enough to fight in the Second World War, but he was a conscientious objector, and his parents, they were amazing, the way they kind of facilitated and understood his and accepted him, because he was a vegetarian and used to wear his hair long, and apparently his coat inside out with a red lining. And Granny used to go and find tinned nut meat for him, and take it to him in prison when he was serving his time as a CO. They were amazingly understanding, and so I think, my parents themselves were the same, non-judgmental, very trusting, just wanted us to get on with what we wanted to do, really. That was my experience. And I've always felt that my parents have been my best friends. And I miss my dad very much. So, that was sort of childhood. I was in the local drama club. I kind of felt the world was my oyster. And I was very, very lucky. And I had this one great friend, Jenny, I had other friends, but Jenny was my closest, and we did everything together. We've remained close. We still go out and, walking expeditions together and read books, and, so then I suppose 14 as a teenager, all of that was going on through my teens. I loved drawing and art, thought I might go to art school, but I was also in the local amateur dramatics, loved drama, and didn't know what I was going to do. I felt very romantic, excited about the idea of finding the man. My dad was a great romantic, and I think I had very, very romantic views of love and partnership, which was completely unrealistic, and was brought up with a very kind of natural approach to the body. I never felt kind of ashamed about my body. Felt very content within it. And being a girl, there was no problem with having periods, for example. I remember at People's High School, there was one girl once I remember her period started, and my friend Jenny and I, we realised what was going on, and this girl but she wouldn't talk about it, but she was in a terrible state, and we kind of took her aside, because Jenny's mum was a very fascinating, extraordinary woman. She was an artist and quite a rebel, and Jenny was brought up as very sort of with kind of, I suppose, liberal ideas. I don't know. I hate these kind of terms, but we were kind of comfortable in our bodies. But I remember us comforting this girl who had not been told what was happening, and she was in such a state, and I don't think the school really helped her. But yeah, there was all of that, and I had boyfriends, and I remember there was a chap I met at an Italian waiter in Edinburgh who was absolutely gorgeous, and my dad used to meet me off the bus because I had a back problem in my teens, and I used to go to a chiropractor in Edinburgh, and Dad would meet me off the bus in Edinburgh, and we would go to a cafe first, and then he would take me to the chiropractor. And I remember going with Dad, and Dad could speak Italian. He'd spent time studying in Italy. Briefly, he had a 6-month scholarship just not long after Mum and Dad were married. And so we met this Italian waiter there who's absolutely gorgeous. And but I think this chap was homesick, and I think he just loved talking to Dad Italian. And so he was a boyfriend for a wee while, but nothing really happened. We climbed Mendick Hill, which is one of the Pentlands, once, and he tried to have his way with me, but I said no. And he was very funny, and I was so lucky, because it could have been a nightmare, but actually he said okay. So I didn't have any bad experiences with men. I felt pretty confident, I think I was probably looking for some amazing artist male, and I think that made me put myself in some kind of a subordinate role in my head. And I think that was partly because I had this father who was very, very strong personality. Very positive force in my life, entirely positive. But there is no doubt that I didn't take myself really seriously as a woman, in the sense that I did think of, being a mother very early on. I've always loved children, always wanted to have a family. But that was kind of really pretty front on in my head from a very early age. And I did have this sense of an incredible dilemma about having children or work, which is ridiculous, because I don't think my parents it's not ridiculous, it's the position that many, the majority of women have been forced into, I think, by societal kind of assumptions. And I don't think I was free of that. I don't think I was. I mean, my mum looked after us. She did do work. She was an auxiliary nurse for years before she actually trained as a nurse. She also did piano lessons to help support my dad's income. And in fact, she was the main bread earner in the end, because being a freelance musician was impossible financially. But yeah, I think that was a major thing for me, sort of wanting to find a man and have children, but also wanting to be an actor and wanting to be an amazing actor and have an, but I saw these two in conflict. And anyway, at my friend Jenny's wedding on the Isle of Skye, aged 22, I think, I met Angus MacNichol, Nuas MacNichol. This was I'd been at RADA at that point. In London. I'd trained as an actor, and I had been to Stoke-on-Trent, the Victoria Theatre in Stoke-on-Trent, which was a fantastic theatre company, ensemble theatre company. I'd been also in 784 Theatre Company, directed by John McGrath. I'd had some great experiences in theatre. The Victoria Theatre in Stoke-on-Trent was a theatre in the round, an ensemble. We don't have these ensembles anymore in Britain. There's a very small one in Dundee, which used to be much bigger, Dundee Rep, but there aren't any of these ensembles left. That was a marvellous experience. I played all kinds of roles, Shakespeare, Chekhov, and documentaries about local industry, which is what Peter Cheeseman kind of pioneered there in Stoke-on-Trent. Wonderful experience, where we'd go out as the actors and interview people, and then we'd all put together a show, and with music. Anyway, then I went to Jenny's wedding, met Angus, and was just so excited to meet this poet, Gaelic poet. I had experienced Gaelic a bit through our family holidays. We used to rent a wee house in Tiree in the summers in my early teens, and that was just wonderful. So I'd heard Gaelic in Tiree. And I heard Gaelic for the first time on stage when Dolina McLennan sang in The Cheeveat, the Stag and the Black Oil, which was an amazing production and kind of mind-blowing. I saw the original of that and joined the company before I went to RADA, actually. So yeah, met Angus, was blown away by him, and I proposed to him, hardly knowing him. And we would see each other for weekends. I was still down in Stoke-on-Trent. I used to get the late night train from Crewe, get to Glasgow Queen Street, and then in the middle of the night get the train up to Oban, and then I'd arrive at like 4 a.m, as I remember it, and you'd hear all the ship's riggings clinking in the harbour. And Angus was the writer in residence within Coman Gaelach, the Gaelic Language Society, and sleeping on his office floor because he couldn't get accommodation. So that's where we stayed, and it was very romantic. And then we got married a year later, and we'd only had the odd weekend together, so we kind of didn't really know each other. So quite high risk, really, when I think back. But anyway, we were married for 42 years. But the next year, we had a baby who died after she was 10 days old. She had virtually no small intestine, which was unknown. It wasn't a genetic thing. It was one of those things that just apparently appears in the small print in the textbooks. That was, a bit like the experience in South Africa. It was huge, absolutely huge. It was just, I remember the grief of that, and which was almost like a physical pain, physical. It was just such a disappointment. It was just, well, disappointment's not the word for it. And I wrote about that in this, my first portrait collection, If This Were Real. It's called Co-op Funeral Parlour. My heart stops at the waxed apple cheeks, plump and impossibly polished. Your head in my palm yesterday, skull barely masked by paper skin. You were undeniably mine. An imposter lies in this small white box we ordered. A collector's doll, lace-framed face mounted on a slice of shop window silk. I would strip the pinned folds, find the miracle of your miniature hands, blood cooled to blue beneath each nail. But a tail of brown thread, carelessly trimmed, curls below the jaw's angle like a worm emerging from puckered skin. I draw back, let panic drain, search for signs of you, and detect at last the downturn of your top lip, my mouth's copy, under a lipstick blur. Yeah, it was a kind of shock of seeing our baby, Marcelly, kind of, they put sort of cosmetics on her and to kind of, make her look good. But she didn't look like the baby that I was holding, in hospital. So that was a shock. And anyway, I went back to the Victoria Theatre and then about 8 years later, we had our son, Rob, who's just wonderful. And that was tremendous. And then 10 years after that, our daughter Galina, who has Down syndrome, and she's just glorious. And in fact, I have her painting on the front of my book of short stories, Letting Go. It's a painting of a tree. It's not a painting, it's oil pastels. And I thought it was the perfect image for the title, Letting Go, the leaves letting, the tree letting go of its leaves. And it almost looks like a human, the trunk, So, I would say it's taken, in all that time I've done lots of things. I set up Stellar Quines Theatre Company, Scotland's women's theatre company, having worked with Monstrous Regiment in London. I worked with that Monstrous Regiment was the kind of grandmother of British women's theatre, feminist theatre, and working with them, it just inspired me because it was extraordinary on the first day of rehearsal. I had never experienced this in all the rehearsals, I had experienced and all the productions I've been in. They were all women, the actors, the stage management, the lighting designer, the set designer, the script writer, director. There was one male actor, the rest, it was all women. And it was an extraordinary thing to be in a rehearsal room where you were normally the minority as a woman, to experience that. And I thought, well, could we have that in Scotland? So I initiated that in Scotland, and it's still going strong. After it's going to be celebrating its 30th anniversary, I think, this year, Stellar Quines. I named it, Star Women, Stellar Quines. So I did manage to do a lot of stuff, but inside my head, I found it quite difficult to take myself as seriously as, would I say as I took men or as men take themselves? I'm not sure. And I think that is a very difficult thing. And it's only now in my 60s that I am really feeling I'm in my own skin, that I can say, I know this, I'm experienced, or I can do this. And if I'm not sure, I can become sure. I think all of that is relatively recent. And it's an astonishing thing to have to say that. But I do think, especially when I've had all my advantages of my upbringing with my wonderful parents and, a marriage with, of course, every marriage has, difficulties. And it was quite fiery at times, my relationship with Angus, and not smooth sailing, but we loved each other and we respected each other. And he was very, always supportive, took turns with the childcare, and, didn't feel as though I was entering his territory when I started writing poetry, which was probably a few years into our marriage. Was always very, very supportive. And yet, I definitely still have felt this thing of it being, that kind of imposter syndrome thing as a woman. But I think it's a societal thing, and I think it's really difficult to not, it's difficult to be immune to that when that is the pervading thing. Pervading culture. Of course, it's much better than it was in my mother's time and my grandmother's time. Things have progressed hugely. And yeah. But yeah, I think that's kind of broadly speaking, my journey. That's an overworked word, isn't it? Journey. My way to sort of becoming a woman and feeling that I'm in my own skin, and I have worked right through having children. I've taken my children with me to rehearsal. I've had a childminder in a room off the rehearsal room when Rob was 7 weeks old, with the agreement that I could breastfeed him whenever he needed me, which actually turned out to be just 4 hourly. It seemed to work out. It also made me feel much more efficient being a parent when I was working, because I knew I had to get through the work, do the work, and get back to the child. So I think that women become very efficient workers, mothers. That's certainly the impact it had on me. I couldn't be bothered just sort of messing around and blethering. I would want to get on with the work. Let's do it, because I've got my other responsibility. So that was an interesting experience to discover that about myself. But yeah, I often took my kids with me. I remember once when a childminder wasn't available, rehearsing with Rob on my back, and I was playing Desdemona in Othello, and he was in a backpack on my back. And I remember Jerry Mulgrew, the director of the show we were doing when he was 7 weeks. One day the childminder wasn't available, and Jerry directed with Rob on his shoulder. With health and safety nowadays, I think you wouldn't be allowed to do that, but I just kind of did it all with the kids, and I think it was good for them, because it gave them rich experiences as well. So that's me being a girl, teenager, and a young woman, and a working mother, and an artist.